Hey y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and today we are going to talk about a U.S. News article ranking Seattle as the 13th best large metro area out of the 150 that they surveyed in the U.S. Coming up. Last year, I posted a video about the state of Washington being rated as the #1 state to live in according to U.S. News, and that was heading into 2020. They haven't posted their most recent state rankings yet for 2021, but they did just release their most recent city rankings, and the city of Seattle ranked number 13 out of 150 metro areas that they surveyed. In order to make this U.S. News list, the place has to have a good value, be a desirable place to live, have a strong job market, and a high quality of life. In order to determine their best cities ranking, they came up with 5 different indexes. Number 1, job market index. Number 2, value index. Number 3, quality of life index. Number 4, desirability index. And number 5 was net migration. If you're somebody who likes to dig into the numbers or really get into the methodology a little bit more, I'll make sure to link up this article down below so you can get into the nitty-gritty. I'm not going to focus too much on it. I want to talk a little bit more about Seattle. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the city of Seattle was rated as the 13th best city to live in 2021. And this is how Seattle stacked up on the different indexes. The desirability index, 8.6 out of 10. The value index, 5.9, mainly due to the high cost of living. The job market, 8.2. Quality of life, 6.4. And net migration, 7.4. And overall, Seattle scored a 7.2 out of 10 on their rankings. The spotlight on Seattle, in my opinion, starts off with a little bit of humor, talking more about the rain in Seattle, which is, I think, the stereotype everybody has about the Seattle area. And if you've lived here, you know the rain's more of like a produce mister than it is a torrential downpour all the time. But it is usually wet all the time, and it is pretty cloudy in the winter. But this article does highlight other areas like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Miami, and there are a lot of other metro areas that have more rainfall than Seattle on an annual basis. But I think what people, when they come here, experience is it's just cloudy all the time, and it's always wet. It seems to be wet, but heck, you're in a rainforest, which also contributes to a lot of the beauty, natural beauty in Seattle and the surrounding area. Now, the article also talks a little bit more about the city itself. And while Seattle itself is a draw for people, it's really the surrounding area and the accessibility to the mountains, the Puget Sound, the ocean that really attract people to the area. Yes, it's beautiful in Seattle, but you're so close to a lot of other fun things. And so while I like living in the Seattle area, and I personally live on the north side of the city, I live in Edmonds, Washington, about 20 minutes out of Seattle, it is so accessible to the surrounding areas, and there's so much to do, especially if you're somebody that likes the outdoors. A few quick stats that they share in the article that I think might be helpful for you if you're not from Seattle. The metro population, 3.8 million. The average annual salary, $65,000. The average temperature is a high of 60 degrees and a low of 45 degrees. Now, I'll say it's much nicer in the summertime than it is in the winter, but we do have a more temperate climate than a lot of places that I visited. Median age, 37, which is also why I think Seattle rated higher on the best places for young people to live. And they rated Seattle as the 7th best place for a young, aspiring business person to live. So if you're somebody who's younger and you're wanting to get started with your career, Seattle was actually rated even higher on that list than it is on the overall best places to live list. Now, median home price here, $463,600. Now that's for the whole metro area. If you want to live in the city of Seattle, you're looking at closer to $800,000 median price. And there are other areas like Bellevue or Kirkland where you're going to pay even more than that to live. But if you want to live in Seattle area and you're willing to drive maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes of a commute, you can probably get yourself into a little bit more affordable situation. But reading this, 463 you got to be at least 30 to 45 minutes outside of the city without any traffic to get a price like that. Average annual rainfall, 37.5 inches, which, as we talked about earlier, not as much as you'd think for the reputation that Seattle has. It's more cloudy than it is rainy. It is still ranking, I think, if I remember correctly, second highest cloudy city in the whole US. But most of the cloudiest cities in the US are in Washington, right along the Puget Sound. Unemployment rate, 3.3%. Median monthly rent, $1,400. Again, that's the whole metro area. So if you want to be in Seattle, Bellevue, or one of the closer in suburbs, you're going to be paying more than that most likely. But if you're willing to drive, you can get a little bit more affordable rent. And average commute time, 30.7 minutes. Now again, that's if you are living closer in. With COVID right now, as we're recording this video, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's really easy to get into the office. It takes me 15 minutes to drive from the suburbs into the outskirts of Seattle. But if you were to have normal traffic, I mean, it was taking me 45 minutes to get into the office. So traffic is substantially lower right now. And I'm assuming this article is taking into account normal traffic patterns. But you're probably looking at more 45 minutes to an hour if you live in one of the further out suburbs where it is more affordable to live. Now, speaking of affordability, according to their value index, Seattle scored a 5.9 out of 10, which is lower on their index than a lot of the other metro areas. And that's mainly because of the cost of living, right, based on income. Now, the average housing costs in Seattle, according to their stats, $463,600, and that's 2019 housing costs. So it's interesting. We're talking about best places to live heading into 2021, and we're using 2019 stats. So just keep that in mind. These numbers aren't quite accurate, but the U.S. as a whole heading into 2020, $232,933. So we're looking at almost double housing costs in Seattle versus everywhere else. But incomes are also substantially higher. So that's why you see it only slightly below maybe where some of these other places are. Now, if we dig into the job situation in Seattle a little bit more, the overall job index score was super high. Seattle scored 8.2 out of 10, which was way above what some of these other metro areas scored and really healthy according to the survey. The average salary, $65,400 in Seattle, as we already talked about, and the average across the US, $51,960. Now you'll see that's not a huge jump to see how much more expensive it is to live here. I will say though that there are a substantial amount of people that make more money than those averages, and those would be people maybe that are at Amazon, Microsoft, Zillow, or some of the other tech companies, maybe Google or Facebook working here. And then we also have Boeing employees, and there's a wide range of different employees at these companies. There's people in the management sectors and in the tech sectors, and then there's people that in Boeing that are manufacturing, and you've got people at Amazon that are fulfilling orders. So you've got a lot of different types of people and incomes at these different companies. But the average person maybe at one of these companies might be making a little bit more than you're seeing on these numbers. The unemployment rate heading into 2020, again, these numbers are a little old for a just recently published survey, but heading into 2020, 3.3% unemployment rate, which was better than the national average by almost 0.5%. And that's substantially down from back in 2010, but I think most places are substantially down from 2010 if you look at this graph. So Seattle's in a good place on the unemployment rate, but not a ton better than everywhere else. I think everybody's doing better than they used to be. I wonder though, with COVID-19, how these numbers are impacted. And again, we don't have that data right now. They also dug a little bit into the schooling here. And on the index, Seattle scored a 7.1 out of 10 for the metro area. And that score was lower than a lot of other places. And this index was looking into college readiness. And in their statistic, about 200,000 students, about 11,000 teachers, which made about an 18-to-1 teacher-student ratio. Now, just from living here, the reputation of the Seattle School District, and Seattle, we love you, the Seattle School District has always been that it's not as good as some of the school districts in the suburbs. And it's hard to go into it, and I know that's super subjective, but if you look at some of the online rating systems like Great Schools or Niche.com, you're going to find that some of the school districts on the outlying areas, some of the suburbs, have a lot higher ratings than the city of Seattle itself. So when people are asking me about the best schools in the area, I typically refer them to one of those sites so they can see why schools are getting those ratings. Because sometimes a school maybe ranks really high in diversity, but it's a little lower in test scores, college readiness, and vice versa. Sometimes some areas have lower diversity numbers and really, really high test scores. But the averages are impacted by that. So for everybody, they have a different thing they're looking to get out of school. What I found is a lot of people also jump into the private school system here. We don't really have a charter school system like some states. It's really your public schools and your private schools. The last thing that they looked at here was the crime in these large metro areas. And Seattle ranked a little bit better than most of these places, 7 out of 10. I know growing up here, I've always felt relatively safe living in the Seattle area. There's going to be certain areas, specifically maybe around the malls and things like that, where you're going to have higher crime rates. But in general, I haven't experienced or really felt threatened. And maybe that's because I've lived in the suburbs, and maybe there are other factors that we're not really taking into account. But I know personally, I've always felt relatively safe living in the Seattle area, and I think the data backs that up as well. As I reflect on this article and the idea that Seattle is one of the best places to live in the US, I've always felt that way personally. I've visited a lot of different places, and I'm always happy to come home. And I think a lot of it is because of the beauty in the area, and also a lot of the other things that were talked about that make Seattle great. Now, it's not perfect, and some of you watching this video, I'm sure I'm gonna get comments about the politics in Seattle. There have been tons of political comments in the Washington State video, and I know for me personally, I've lived here my whole life and experienced the politics here in Seattle, and it's pretty divided on what should happen in the city, what should happen outside of the city, and there are people that have lots of different views on what politics should look like, and I don't want to really get into a political discussion here. That's not the purpose of this video, but I will say it's been this way in Seattle for at least as long as I can remember. So what we've been seeing more recently isn't really that surprising to me. It's pretty much what the direction has been over the long haul. But I think we've started to see things that maybe are getting a little bit more attention nationally here recently than we have in the past. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it all the way to the end, I know that you found some value in it, or you were at least interested in the content. So please give it a thumbs up or engage with me down in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you could benefit from more content like this, specifically related to the Seattle real estate market, please consider subscribing.